Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the History Desk. I am so glad to have you here, and thank you for tuning in for another episode. First of all, this was going to be one long episode with the Saratoga and Philadelphia campaigns, but after typing it up, it was way too long, so we're going to break it into two episodes. This episode will be on the Saratoga campaign, and our next episode will be on the Philadelphia campaign. But we'll get them both taken out. They're very important, and it ends the battles in the northern colonies before we switch to the southern colonies. But, last episode, we covered the New Jersey campaign, which was extremely important because it kept the colonial army together. It showed that they could win. It showed that they could fight against the British and actually win at the battles of Trenton and Princeton. Though they were very small victories, they did show some ability for these rebels, these colonials, to fight against this big power in the British. But now, they have retreated, everybody's retreated to their winter camps. So we're going to start the new campaigning season of 1777. So, if you're ready, let's get started. So after the Battle of Princeton, both armies returned to their winter camps. The Continentals were camped at Morristown, which was protected from the coast by the Watchung Mountains, which were a series of low ridges. Washington established forward outposts east and south of these ridges to not only serve as a defense against a potential British attack into the hills, but also as a launching point for some raids. Over the course of January and February, the Continental Army shrank to about 2,500 regulars, as those incentives that Washington had given out before the battles of Trenton, they had ended, so the enlistments were up, they went home. A large number of militia from New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania bolstered these forces and would play the main part of the skirmishes during the winter. The British had originally deployed posts as far north as Hackensack to New Brunswick. The garrison in the area numbered around 10,000. After the events of the battles of Trenton and Princeton, and with the militia presence in the area in January, General Cornwallis withdrew most of his northern troops to the shores of the Hudson. This resulted in the concentration of troops to overflow the housing that was available. This was housing abandoned by the residents, and forced some of his troops to even live on board ships anchored nearby. These cramped quarters led to an increase in camp-related disease and caused morale to drop during the winter. The area had been heavily plundered by Americans during their retreats, and there was little left in the way of local provisions. The men subsided largely on rations of salt pork, but their animals required fresh fodder, for which they would send out raiding expeditions. Because of the need for food and supplies during the winter months, this would lead to a series of small engagements called the Forage War, taking place between January and March of 1777. Early in the winter, Washington sent out detachments to try and remove any remaining supplies from the region that the British may have access to. Cornwallis would send out small foraging and raiding parties as well in January, which would come into contact with much larger formations of American militia, sometimes numbering 300 and up, which would lead to large casualties by the British in these small raids. One example of the early winter skirmishes is when Brigadier General Dickerson mustered 450 militia to drive off a British foraging expedition in the Battle of Millstone on January 20th. Washington had given his commanders a wide latitude on how to act during the winter months. His main focus was for them to be constantly harassing the enemy. The early success of the Forage War by Continentals depended on successful intelligence provided by patriots in the area. Even supply convoys, which were bringing goods to the British from other camps, were not immune to these attacks. The countryside and rivers provided a perfect opportunity for sniping and raiding these convoys. These events led to the British to change tactics and attempt to lure the militia units into traps involving large numbers of British regulars. This new tactic was not completely successful either, since the militia commanders in the area had a better understanding of the geography and were able to use terrain to set more elaborate traps. In one encounter in late February, British Colonel Mawhood, thinking he had outflanked a party of New Jersey militia, suddenly found his advanced troops surrounded by another much larger force of militia. As he retreated towards Aboy, more and more militia appeared, eventually inflicting 100 casualties. The elite grenadiers of the 42nd Foot, which were part of this vanguard, were badly mauled in the action. Another British force of 2,000 was repulsed by Maxwell in another well-organized attack just a few weeks later. The ongoing tensions took their toll on the British and made them stay alert at all hours of the day and night, even causing many of the men to sleep with their clothes on and leave their horses saddled. Some forage was provided by New York, but it could never be enough to support the army, causing the British to provide much of their supplies from Europe at great risk and cost to the Royal Navy. These small engagements of the so-called Forage War would come to an end as the 1777 military campaign started to take shape in April. General Cornwallis would punctuate these winter skirmishes with his attack on the Continental Army post at Bound Brook on April 13th. In the battle, he very nearly captured its commander, Benjamin Lincoln. He outnumbered the Americans 2,000 to 500. The British scattered the militia, but met stiff resistance from the 8th Pennsylvania Regiment. The British would capture 3 3-pound guns and 20 to 30 men and kill 6 Americans, but the bulk of Lincoln's force were able to get away. Washington would move his army from his winter quarters at Morristown to a forward position at Middlebrook in late May to better react to any British movements. Northern and coastal New Jersey would continue to be the site of skirmishing and raiding by British troops in New York City for the rest of the war. Now that the winter was over, the weather was now right for the British to start their new campaigns to end the war and defeat the colonists. 2 campaigns would take place during 1777 and early 1778. Saratoga, which was the campaign by General Burgoyne coming south from Quebec in an attempt to take Albany and cut off the New England colonies, and one by General Howe, which was the goal of taking Philadelphia. In some points, these 2 campaigns will overlap on dates. Battles will happen at the same time. But because Burgoyne's is initiated first, and it really is the larger of the 2 campaigns, that's the one we're going to take a look at first, and we'll take a look at Howe's expedition in our next episode. Near the end of 1776, it became apparent to many in England that pacification of New England would be very difficult due to the high concentration of patriots there. And so London decided to isolate New England and concentrate on central and southern regions of the colonies where loyalist support might be rallied, in their opinion. On November 30th, 1776, General Howe wrote Lord Germain, the British Secretary of State for the colonies, outlining an ambitious plan for his campaigning in 1777. Howe wrote that if Germain sent him a large number of reinforcements, that he could launch several offensives, including 10,000 men up the Hudson River to take Albany. He then planned to move south in autumn and take the U.S. capital in Philadelphia. Howe would soon change his mind after writing the letter, with the possibility of reinforcements not arriving in time, and the Continental Army's retreat into winter of 76 and 77, Howe believed that Philadelphia would be a much more vulnerable target. Because of this, he made the capture his primary objective of his 1777. Howe sent Germain his revised plan, which was received in a letter in February 23rd of 1777. In December of 1776, General John Burgoyne met with Lord Germain in London to go over his plan for the coming campaigning season. Burgoyne, who was seeking to command a major force, proposed to isolate New England by an invasion from Quebec into New York. This had already been attempted by General Carleton in 1776 after the failed American invasion of Quebec, but he had stopped short of a full-scale invasion to it being late in the season and close to winter. Carleton was heavily criticized in London for not taking the initiative at the time of the American retreat from Quebec and was already disliked by Germain. These factors, along with the recently failed attempt of his rival Henry Clinton to take Charleston, placed Burgoyne in a good position to command the 1777 Northern Campaign. He presented Lord Germain with a written copy of his plans on February 28, 1777, and in turn, Germain approved it and gave him command of the expedition. Burgoyne's invasion from Quebec had 2 components. He would lead the main force of about 8,000 men south from Montreal along Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley, while a second column of about 2,000 men, led by Barry St. Leger, would move from Lake Ontario east down the Mohawk River Valley in a strategic diversion. Both forces would converge on Albany, where they would link up with troops from Howe's army proceeding up the Hudson. Control of Lake Champlain, Lake George, the Hudson River route from Canada to New York would cut off New England from the rest of the American colonies. The last part of the proposal, the advance of General Howe up the Hudson from New York City, proved to be the most controversial. Germain approved the plan after he had already received and approved Howe's plan detailing his offensive against Philadelphia. It is unclear if Germain told Burgoyne about Howe's plan, but as he was still in London at the time, some believe he did. Another possibility is that he was not notified until the campaign was already underway. Some believe that he had known that he would have been prepared for the problems his expedition would encounter in the months to come. Did Howe, Germain, and Burgoyne have the same expectations of the degree of Howe was supposed to help with Quebec? We don't know. What is clear is that Germain either left his generals with too much latitude, or he did not clearly define the overall strategy to them. In March 1777, Germain had approved Howe's plan for Philadelphia and did not include any express orders for Howe to go to Albany. Germain did, however, send Howe a copy of his instructions to Carleton, which stated plainly that the Northern Army was to make a junction with Howe's army in Albany. Also in a letter from Germain to Howe, dated May 18, 1777, he made clear that the Philadelphia expedition should be finished in time for Howe to meet up with the force coming from Canada to be put under his command. This letter was not received by Howe until after he had already departed New York for the Chesapeake. To attack Philadelphia, Howe could either have moved overland through New Jersey or by sea via the Delaware Bay. Both options would have allowed him to be in position to assist Burgoyne if needed. The route he would choose to take, though, the Chesapeake Bay, was very time-consuming and left him unable to support the attack coming from the north as Germain has envisioned. The decision to take this route would be so difficult to understand, many of Howe's critics back in London would accuse him of deliberate treachery. Burgoyne returned to Quebec on May 6, 1777, with a letter from Lord Germain which approved the plan but lacked some details. This would produce another problem, conflict of command, which plagued the British throughout the war. Lieutenant General Burgoyne outranked Major General Carleton, but Carleton was still the governor of Quebec. Germain's instructions to the generals had specifically limited Carleton's role to operations in Quebec. This slight against Carleton, along with his failure to get command of the expedition, led to his eventual resignation later in 1777, and to his refusal to supply troops from Quebec to garrison forts at Crown Point and Ticonderoga after they were captured. George Washington encamped at Morristown, New Jersey, and the American commanders did not have a good idea of the British plan of 1777. The main question of Washington and his generals, Horatio Gates and Philip Schuyler, were both responsible for the Continental's northern department and the defense of the Hudson River, was of the movements of Howe's army out of New York. At the time, they had no significant information about what was being planned by British forces out of Quebec, despite Burgoyne's statement that everyone in Montreal knew what he was planning. The three generals disagreed on what his movements would be, and Congress also had an opinion that he would likely move to New York by sea. Partly because of the lack of knowledge and the idea it would isolate supply lines if Howe moved north, the garrisons at Fort Ticonderoga and elsewhere in the Mohawk and Hudson Valley were not greatly reinforced. Schuyler took the measure in April of 1777 of sending a large regiment under Colonel Peter Gavensroot to rehabilitate Fort Stanwix in the upper Mohawk Valley as a step in defending against British movements in the area. Washington also ordered 4 regiments to be held at Peekskill in New York that would be directed either north or south in response to British movements. Somewhere he could decide if Howe came north or Burgoyne came south, he could move them wherever he needed to. American troops were allocated throughout the New York theater in June of 1777, with about 1,500 troops in outposts along the Mohawk River, and about 3,000 in the Hudson River Highlands under General Israel Putnam. and Schuyler commanding about 4,000 troops, including the militia and troops at Fort Ticonderoga under St. Clair. Most of Burgoyne's army had arrived in Quebec in the spring of 1776 and had participated in the routing of Continental Army troops from the province. In addition, the British regulars, the troops in Quebec, included several regiments of Hessians and other German mercenaries, under the command of Baron Friedrich Adolf Redissel. Of these regular forces, 200 British regulars and 300 to 400 Germans were assigned to St. Leger's Mohawk Valley expedition, and about 3,500 men remained in Quebec to protect the province. The remaining forces were assigned to Burgoyne for the campaign to Albany. The regular forces were supposed to be augmented to by about as many as 2,000 militia raised in Quebec. By June, Carleton had managed to only raise 3 small companies. Burgoyne also expected as many as 1,000 Indians to support the expedition, but only about 500 joined between Montreal and Crown Point. The army was beset with transport difficulties before it even left Quebec, which was something neither Burgoyne nor Carleton had anticipated. As the expedition was to travel mainly over the water, there were few wagons, horses, and other draft animals to move the large amount of supplies and equipment over the land parts of the route. Only in early June did Carleton issue orders to procure carts sufficient to move the army. Consequently, these carts would be poorly constructed of green wood, and the teams would be controlled by civilians, which were prone to desertion. On June 13, 1777, Burgoyne and Carleton reviewed the troops at St. John's on the Richelieu River, just north of Lake Champlain, and Burgoyne was ceremoniously given command. In addition to 5 sailing ships built the previous year, a 6th had been built, along with the 3 that were captured during the Battle of Valcour Island in the years before. These would provide some transport as well as military cover for the large fleet of transport boats moving the army south on the lake. The army, which was launched the next day, had about 7,000 regulars and over 130 artillery pieces ranging from light mortars to 24-pound pieces. The regulars were organized into an advance force under Brigadier General Simon Fraser, and 2 divisions. Major General William Phillips led the 3,900 British regulars on the right, while Baron Redissel's 3,100 Brunswickers held the left. His troops set off in good condition, but some were more, notably the German dragoons, were poorly equipped for wilderness fighting. Colonel St. Leger's expedition was also assembled by mid-June. His force was a mixed force of British regulars, loyalists, Hessians, and Rangers from the Indian Department, which numbered about 750 men, and left Laquin, near Montreal, on June 23rd. Burgoyne's army traveled up the lake and occupied the undefended Fort Crown Point on June 30th. The screening activities of the Army's Indian support was highly effective at keeping the Americans from learning the details of the British movements. General Arthur St. Clair, who had been left in command of Fort Ticonderoga and its surrounding defenses, with a garrison about 3,000 regulars and militia, had no idea on July 1 of the full strength of British army, which large elements of which were just 4 miles away. St. Clair had been ordered by General Schuyler to hold as long as possible, and he planned 2 avenues of retreat when the time came. The first was by water to Skenesborough, the southernmost navigable port of the lake, and the second was an overland by the rough road leading east towards Hubbardton in the New Hampshire Grants, or present-day Vermont. The American forces consisted of only 2 regiments, 3 composite units, and other understrength corps, Francis's and Marshall's Massachusetts Regiment, and the New Hampshire Continentals. A height, called Sugarloaf, now known as Mount Defiance, overlooked both Ticonderoga and Independence, and large cannons on the heights would make the forts impossible to defend. This tactical problem had been pointed out by John Trumbull when Gates was in command. It was believed impossible for the British to place cannons on the heights, even though Trumbull, Anthony Wayne, and at a time an injured Benedict Arnold climbed to the top and noted that gun carriages could probably be dragged up. The defense, or lack thereof, of Sugarloaf was complicated by the widespread notion that Fort Ticonderoga, with the nickname of the Gibraltar of the North, had to be held. Neither abandoning the fort nor garrisoning it with a small force was viewed as a politically viable option. Defending the fort and the associated outer works would require all the troops currently there, leaving none to defend Sugarloaf. Furthermore, as stated before, Washington and Congress were of the mind that Burgoyne would attack from the south, moving his troops to New York City. Burgoyne had deployed Fraser's advance force and the right column on the west side of the lake, hoping to cut off the defenses at Mount Hope. Riedesel and the German column were deployed on the east side of the lake, where their objective was Mount Independence and the road to Hubbardton. The order of advance was given on July 2nd. On July 2nd, St. Clair decided to withdraw his men occupying a defense post on Mount Hope because they were exposed and subject to capture. The detachment set fire to the works and retreated to the old French lines, getting away not long before British troops arrived. That afternoon, a company of British troops and Indians came towards those lines, but not near enough to do any significant damage. St. Clair ordered his men to hold fire until the enemy was closer, but James Wilkinson fired at a British soldier, spurring the untrained defenders to follow suit. The soldier Wilkinson had fired on fell, and the British troops fled. When the man was captured, it turned out that he was not injured, but in fact drunk, and this was why he fell over. Through the deception of putting the man with someone posing to be a captured loyalist, St. Clair was able to learn the nature of the force opposing him. Fraser's advance force occupied Mount Hope on July 3rd. Burgoyne ordered some of the scouts and Indians over to the east side of the lake for recon ahead of the German column, and brought some of the Germans over to the west side. Some of the British camp was placed close enough to the American lines that they were harassed by gunfire, but this would not stop them from making repairs to the bridges of the Portage Road between Ticonderoga and Lake George. British engineers eventually discovered Sugarloaf and realized the importance of the battle. Starting on the 2nd of July, they began building gun emplacements, being careful not to alert the Americans of their presence there. They spent several days drawing some of their larger guns up the slope. The idea was to spring the trap when the Germans were in position to cut off the American retreat. On July 4th, the Americans had a small celebration with some toasts to commemorate the previous year's Declaration of Independence. That night, during the celebrations, the British lost their element of surprise on Sugarloaf when some Indians lit fires, alerting the Americans to their presence there. On the morning of July 5th, St. Clair held a war council in which the decision to retreat was made. Since their position was exposed, they delayed until nightfall, when their movements could be concealed. In the conversation with his men, St. Clair said that he could save his character and lose the army if he held the fort, or save the army and lose his character if he retreated, given an indication of the political reaction he was expecting to his decision. All possible armaments, as well as invalids, camp followers, and supplies, were loaded on to a fleet of more than 200 boats that began to move up the lake toward Skenesborough, and accompanied by Colonel Pierce Long's regiment. Owing to the shortage of boats, 4 invalids were left behind, as were their very largest cannon and a variety of supplies, everything from tents to cattle. The rest of the army crossed to Mount Independence and headed down the Hubbardton Road, which Riedesel's forces had not yet reached. A handful of men were left at the pontoon bridge with loaded cannons to fire on the British when they arrived, but they were drunk the next morning when the British did arrive. The British would occupy the fort without firing a shot, and a detachment of Fraser's and Riedesel's troops would set out to pursue the Americans on the road, while Burgoyne hurried some of his troops up the lake towards Skenesborough. The Americans made good time on the Hubbardton Road, and most of their force reached Castleton, 30 miles away, on the evening of July 6th. The rear guard of the Americans was caught up with and engaged, resulting in the Battle of Hubbardton. On his way to Castleton, St. Clair stopped to let his men rest at Hubbardton, while he waited for the rear guard of the army to catch up. When they did not arrive in time, St. Clair decided to move on and left Colonel Seth Warner and the Green Mountain Boys, being along with the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment under Colonel Nathan Hale, to wait the rest of the rear guard while the main part of the army moved on to Castleton. When Colonel Francis and his 11th Massachusetts Regiment, which made up the rear guard, and Hale's forces arrived in Hubbardton, Warner decided to go against St. Clair's orders and to spend the night there rather than moving on. Warner, who had experience in rear guard actions while serving in the invasion of Quebec, arranged the camp in a defensive position on Monument Hill and set patrols out to guard the road to Ticonderoga. Baron Riedesel caught up with Fraser, who was pursuing the army at about 4 p.m. and insisted that his men could go no further without making camp. Fraser, who allowed the army to stop and make camp, outranged Riedesel and pointed out that it was authorized to engage the enemy, and he would be leaving camp at 3 a.m. the next morning. He advanced until he found a site about 3 miles from Hubbardton, where his troops camped for the night. Riedesel waited for the bulk of his men at about 1,500 strong, and he also made camp. Fraser's men were up at 3 a.m., but they didn't make good time because of the darkness. Riedesel left his camp at 3 a.m. with a picked group of men, and was still behind Fraser when the latter arrived at Hubbardton near dawn, and very nearly surprised elements of Hale's regiment, which were scattered in the early fighting. A messenger had arrived from General St. Clair delivering news that the British had reached Skenesborough, where the elements of the retreating army had planned to regroup, and that a more Cretaceous route to the Hudson River was now required. St. Clair's instructions were to follow him immediately to Rutland. Francis's men had formed a column to march out around 7:15 when the British vanguard began cresting the hill behind them. Rapidly reforming into a line behind some cover, the Massachusetts men unleashed a withering volley of fire at the winded British. General Fraser took stock of the situation and decided to send a detachment around to flank the American left, at the risk of exposing his own left, which he hoped would hold until Riedesel arrived. Riedesel arrived at the top of another hill, which he observed the American line, now including parts of Hale Regiment, was in fact pressing on Fraser's left. He therefore sent his grenadiers to support Fraser's flank and directed the Jaegers against the American center. At some point early in the conflict, St. Clair was made aware of the gunfire off in the distance. He immediately dispatched Henry Brockholst, Livingston, and Isaac Doone to send the militia camped closest to Hubbardton down the road to support the action. When they reached the area of those camps, they found those militia companies in full retreat, away from the gunfire in the distance, and no amount of persuasion could convince the men to turn around. Livingston and Dunn continued riding toward Hubbardton. Falling back to a secure position on Monument Hill, the Americans repulsed several vigorous British assaults. Although Colonel Francis was hit in the arm by a shot, he soldiered on, directing troops to a perceived weakness on Fraser's left. The tide of the battle turned when, after more than an hour of battle, Riedesel's grenadiers arrived. These disciplined forces entered the fray singing hymns to an accompaniment of a military band to make them appear more numerous than they actually were. The American flanks were turned, and they were forced to make a desperate race across the open field to avoid being enveloped. Colonel Francis fell in a volley of musket fire as the troops raced away from the advancing British and scattered into the countryside. The remnants of the American rear guard made their way toward Rutland to rejoin the main army. Harassed by Fraser's scouts and Indians, and without food or shelter, it took some of them 5 days to reach the army. Livingston and Dunn were met by retreating Americans on the Castellan Road. They returned to Castleton with the news about the Hubbardton battle, and St. Clair then marched the army towards the American camp at Fort Edward, which it reached on July 12th. Other Americans from the rear guard, including Colonel Hale and 230 men detachment, were captured. As a sign of respect, the British buried Colonel Francis with their Brunswick dead. Baron Riedesel and the Brunswickers departed for Skenesborough the next day. Their departure left Fraser in the most disaffected part of America. Every person was a spy, in his opinion. With 600 tired men, a sizable contingent of prisoners and wounded, and no significant supplies. On July 9th, he sent 300 prisoners under light guard, but with the threats of retaliation should they try to escape, toward Ticonderoga, while he marched his exhausted forces toward Castleton and then Skenesborough. Though many Americans were taken prisoner and marched back to Fort Ticonderoga, the main body of St. Clair's troops escaped. The Battle of Hubbardton was a British tactical victory because the British defeated the American rear guard. It was a strategic victory because the main body of troops for the Americans evacuating Ticonderoga was able to continue the fight against Burgoyne's invasion force. Though most of the troops leaving Ticonderoga went with St. Clair, about 600 men under Colonel Pierce Long, most of them from New Hampshire, sailed up the lake in a flotilla consisting of 5 armed galleys and over 200 smaller transport vessels. These vessels were loaded with many of the sick and wounded from the fort that it could take, along with stores of supplies and ammunition. Believing the log boom and pontoon bridge placed between Ticonderoga and Mount Independence to be significant to delay the British pursuit, Long began to sail up the lake towards Skenesborough, the southernmost navigable point on the lake, at a very leisurely pace. The British, however, were hardly slowed down by the water defenses. Burgoyne, once he learned of the American withdrawal on the morning of July 6th, ordered the defenses to be taken down. With well-placed gunfire, the bridge and boom were eliminated as obstacles in the space of around 30 minutes. Then, Burgoyne, breaking with rigid military discipline, ordered troops to follow southward as rapidly as possible instead of remaining in formation, while he sailed southward in pursuit. Assisted by favorable winds, he was within 3 miles of Skenesborough by the end of July 6th, where the Americans, who had arrived only 2 hours earlier, had a small stockade fort. In an attempt to surround the position, Burgoyne landed about 200 men from the 9th, 20th, and 21st Regiments, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Hill, at a point south of Skenesborough, with the objective of cutting off the road to Fort Anne. The Americans were in a process of portaging around the falls at Lake Skenesborough, or moving the boats across land, when Burgoyne's boats arrived and opened fire. Enterprise, Liberty, and Gates were destroyed by the Americans, and 2 ships, Trumbull and Revenge, were forced to surrender. In the process, many of the American supplies were either destroyed or abandoned to the British. The Americans retreated towards Fort Anne in disarray, but not before starting a fire that eventually engulfed most of the structures at Skenesborough. When they reached Fort Anne, they were met by 400 New York militia under Henry Van Rensselaer that had been sent by General Philip Schuyler from Fort Edward after he received news of the retreat from Fort Ticonderoga. The British pursuers under Hill, when they finally reached the road, captured more American supplies, sick and wounded, and camp followers that trailed behind the main body, and moved south until they were about a mile from Fort Anne. Here they encountered an American reconnaissance party numbering about 170 under Captain James Gray. In the ensuing skirmish, 1 American was killed and 3 more wounded before the Americans retreated to the fort. On the morning of July 8th, a supposed American deserter, who was really a spy, informed Hill that the fort was occupied by nearly 1,000 demoralized troops. Opting not to attack the numerically superior force, Hill sent a message back to Burgoyne outlining the situation. Burgoyne ordered the 20th and 21st Regiments to quick march toward Fort Anne in support, but poor weather hampered their movements and they did not arrive until after the battle. The deserter returned to Fort Anne and reported on the British position and troop strength. Long, seeing how few British soldiers were following him, decided to attack their position. Moving as stealthily as possible, his force tried to surround the British while they were still on the road. However, Hill's men heard the rebel movements on their flanks and retreated to a higher position, abandoning some wounded men, where they were eventually captured by the Americans. When the Americans opened fire, it was a heavy and well-directed fire, according to one British officer. The battle lasted for more than 2 hours, until both sides were nearly out of ammunition, and the British were virtually surrounded by Americans. The sound of an Indian war whoops from the north prompted the Americans to retreat, and they retired to the fort with their wounded, including Van Rensselaer, who had taken a shot in the hip. As it turned out, there were no Indians, but only a single British officer, John Money, of the 9th Regiment, Burgoyne's deputy quartermaster. He had been leading a group of Indians, but when they seemed reluctant to fight the Americans, Money became impatient and ran ahead of them, It was his war cries that brought an end to the battle. Back at the fort, the Americans held a brief council. From a woman that the British had freed, they heard that 2,000 or more British troops under command of General Phillips was rapidly advancing. Long's men, as they were nearly out of ammunition, withdrew toward Fort Edward, burning the stockade fort. Both sides claimed victory in the battle, since the British had successfully stood their ground and the Americans had very nearly forced them to surrender. Any American claim to victory was tempered by the fact that the force they defeated was clearly the vanguard of a much larger British force. The bulk of St. Clair's army retreated through the New Hampshire grants, present-day Vermont. St. Clair issued appeals to the states for militia support and also arranged to have as much of the area's livestock and supplies delivered to Fort Edward on the Hudson River, where the American armies would regroup. St. Clair reached Fort Edward on July 12th, after 5 days of grueling marches. Some of the remnants that had been scattered at Hubbardton rejoined the army, but Seth Warner and the remains of his regiment were stationed at Manchester in the Grants. Burgoyne settled into the house of Loyalist Philip Sheen at Skenesborough, while the pieces of his army regrouped and he considered his next steps. He penned letters describing the British victory, intended for public consumption. When the news reached the capitals of Europe, King George was happy, and the Comte de Rennes was not, as the news effectively scuttled any early proposal for French entry into the war. British diplomats increased pressure on the French and Spanish, demanding that they close their ports to American shipping. While this demand was refused, it marked increased tensions between the powers. The news was also harshly received by Congress and the American public, including slanders that St. Clair and Schuyler had been bribed. On July 10th, Burgoyne issued orders for the next series of movements. Most of the army was to take a rough road from Skenesborough to Fort Edward via Fort Anne, while the heavy artillery was to be transported down Lake George to Fort William Henry, and then over land to Fort Edward. Riedelssel's troops were sent back up the road toward Castleton, primarily as a diversion intended to suggest that he might be aiming for the Connecticut River. Burgoyne's decision to move the army overland via Fort Anne was a curious one, for it contradicted his own earlier commentaries on planning the expedition, in which he precisely observed that defenders could easily block the route. His decision appears to have been motivated by two factors. The first being the perception that moving the army over water via Lake George would require a retrograde movement that could be perceived as a retreat, and the second being the influence of Philip Skene, who probably would benefit by the improved road Burgoyne would have built. General Schuyler, at Albany, when he received word of Ticonderoga's fall, immediately rode to Fort Edward, where he was garrisoned about 700 regulars and 1,400 militia. He decided to make Burgoyne's passage as difficult as possible, using the axe as a weapon. As it was much easier to fell large trees in the enemy's path than to remove them after they were down, this brought Burgoyne's advance to a crawl, tiring his troops and forcing them to use up supplies. On July 11th, Burgoyne wrote to Lord Germain, complaining that the Americans were systematically felling trees, destroying bridges, and damming streams along the road to Fort Edward. Schuyler also employed scorched earth tactics to deny British access to local supplies. In spite of Burgoyne's lack of movement, his scouts were active. Some of Schuyler's work crews were attacked. Schuyler's tactics required Burgoyne to build a road through the wilderness for his guns and troops, a task that would take about 2 weeks. They moved out of Skenesborough on July 24th and reached Fort Edward on July 29th, finding that Schuyler had already abandoned it and retreated that ended at Stillwater, New York. Before he left Skenesborough, Burgoyne was joined by about 500 Indians, mostly Ottawas, but also Fox, Mississaugas, Chippewas, and Ottawas, as well as members of the Iroquois from the Great Lakes region, under leadership of St. Luc de Caen and Charles Michael de Legant. Lieutenant Colonel St. Leger sailed up St. Lawrence and crossed Lake Ontario to arrive at Oswego without incident. He had about 300 regulars supported by 650 Canadian and Loyalist militia, and they were joined by about 1,000 Indians led by John Butler and the Iroquois war chiefs Joseph Brant and Cornplanter. Joseph Brant killed and tortured Indians who did not support the crown. Leaving Oswego on July 25th, they marched to Fort Stanwix on the Mohawk River and began besieging it on August 2nd. At first, St. Leger tried to intimidate the fort's occupants by parading his troops, including the Indians in full war dress, in front of the fort. When this failed, he sent a truce flag bearing a proclamation authored by General Burgoyne. Gansfruit refused to respond. St. Leger then began siege operations, encamping the regulars and artillery on a low rise north of the fort, and most of the Indians and Loyalists in the south, with a picket line of Indian encampments along the Mohawk River. St. Leger's artillery was held up by a tactic that was also used to slow down Burgoyne's army after the fall of Ticonderoga. Gansfruit and his men had systematically felled trees across the wood track that the expedition came down, and St. Leger needed to clear the track to make way for his artillery. This work occupied all but 250 of St. Leger's white men, with the actual encirclement of the fort dominated by the Indians instead. On August 5th, St. Leger received word from Joseph Brant's sister Molly that an American relief column was marching up the Mohawk Valley. Tyrone County's Committee of Safety, held Nicholas Hemmerker, was warned of the possible British attack along the Mohawk River, and he issued a proclamation on July 17th warning of possible military activity and urging the people to respond if needed. Oneida allies warned him on July 30th that the British were just 4 days from Fort Stanwix, and he put out a call to arms. The force raised totaled 800 from the Tyrone County militia, composed primarily of poorly trained farmers who were chiefly of Palatine German descent. They sent out on August 4th and camped near the Oneida village of Oriska on August 5th. A number of the militia dropped out of the column due to their lack of conditioning, but Hemmerker's forces were augmented by a company of 60 to 100 Oneida warriors led by Han Yeri, a strong supporter of the Patriot cause. That evening, Herkimer sent 3 men towards the fort with messages for the fort's commander, Colonel Peter Gansfruit. Gansfruit was to signal the receipt of the message with 3 cannon shots and then sortie to meet the approaching column. The couriers, however, had difficulty getting through British lines, and they did not deliver the message until late the next morning, after the battle was already underway. St. Leger sent a detachment of light infantry from Sir John Johnson's Royal Yorkers towards the position that evening to monitor Hemmerker's movements, and Brant followed early the next morning with about 400 Indians and Butler's Rangers. Many of the indigenous allies were armed with muskets, while others carried only tomahawks and spears. Herkimer held a war council on the morning of August 6th. He wanted to wait because he had not heard the expected signal from the fort, but his captains pressed him to continue, accusing him being of a Tory because his brother was serving under St. Leger. He was stung by the accusations and relented, ordering the column to march on toward Stanwix. About 6 miles from the fort, the road dipped more than 50 feet into a marshy ravine with a stream at the bottom that was about 3 feet wide. Seneca chiefs chose this place to set up an ambush. The king's Royal Yorkers waited behind a nearby rise, and the indigenous allies concealed themselves on both sides of the ravine. The plan was for the Yorkers to stop the head of the column, after which the indigenous troops would attack the extended column. At about 10 a.m., Herkimer's column descended into the ravine, crossed the stream, and began descending the other side, with Herkimer on horseback near the front. Contrary to the plan, the indigenous troops lying in wait opened fire on the rear of the column and taking the column completely by surprise. Colonel Ebenezer Cox was leading the 1st Regiment, and he was shot off his horse and killed in the first volley. Herkimer turned his horse to see the action and was struck by a ball that shattered his leg and killed the horse. Several of his officers carried him to a beech tree and urged him to retire from further danger. He defiantly replied, "I will face the enemy," and calmly sat leaning against the tree, smoking a pipe and giving directions and words of encouragement to the men nearby. The trap had been sprung too early, and portions of the column had not yet entered the ravine. Most of these men panicked and fled. Some of the indigenous fighters pursued them, resulting in a string of dead and wounded that extended for several miles. Between the loss of the column rear and those killed or wounded in the initial volleys, only about one-half of Hermaker's men were likely still fighting 30 minutes into the battle. Some of the attackers, who were not armed with muskets, waited for the flash of an opponent's musket fire before rushing to attack with the tomahawk. Mohawk chief Lewis was fighting with Hermaker's men, and he shot one of the enemies whose fire had been devastatingly accurate, noting that every time he rises up, he kills one of our men. Hermaker's men eventually rallied, fighting their way out of the ravine to the crest just to the west. John Johnson was concerned about the militia's tenacity, so he returned to the British camp and requested some reinforcements from St. Leger, returning with 70 men. A thunderstorm caused about an hour break in the fighting, during which Herkimer regrouped his militia on the higher ground. He instructed his men to fight in pairs. While one man fired and reloaded, the other man waited, and then only fired if attacked. They were to keep at least one weapon loaded at all times to reduce the effectiveness of the tomahawk attacks. Ranger John Butler took time during the thunderstorm to question some of the captives, and thus learned about 3 cannon signal. Johnson and his reinforcements arrived, and Butler convinced them to turn their coats inside out to disguise themselves as a relief party coming from the fort. When the fighting restarted, Johnson and the rest of his Royal Yorkers joined the battle, but a Patriot captain, Jacob Gardner, recognized the face of a Loyalist neighbor. Close combat continued for some time, often hand-to-hand between men who were neighbors. Herkimer's messengers reached the fort at about 11 a.m., and Colonel Gravesroot organized the requested sortie. Lieutenant Colonel Marinus Willett led 250 men from the fort and raided the nearly deserted enemy camps to the south, driving away the few British and Indians left to them, including some women, taking 4 prisoners along the way. They stole blankets and other personal possessions from the indigenous camps, and they also raided John Johnson's camp, taking his letters and other writings, including an intercepted letter to Gravensroot from his fiancée. One of the indigenous allies guarding the camp ran to the battlefield to alert the fellow warriors that their camps were being raided. The Seneca signaled to retire and headed for the camps to protect their women and possessions. This forced the smaller number of German and Loyalist combatants to also withdraw. Hermaker was seriously wounded and many of his captains were killed, and the battered remnant retreated to Fort Dayton. His men carried him from the battlefield, and his leg was amputated, but the operation went poorly and he died on August 16th. The indigenous fighters who died on the battlefield were retrieved by the following day, but many dead and wounded patriots were left on the field. Loyalist John Butler was promoted to lieutenant colonel for his role in the battle. He was authorized to raise a regiment that became known as Butler's Rangers. After the siege was lifted, some Loyalists returned to Quebec, while others joined Burgoyne's campaign on the Hudson, including numerous warriors from various tribes. Brant and Seneca chiefs proposed the next day to continue fighting by pursuing the Patriots downriver towards German Flats, New York, but St. Leger turned them down. This battle marked the beginning of a war among the tribes in the Iroquois Confederacy, as it was the first time that they had fought against one another. The Mohawks, Senecas, Cayugas, and Onondagas were allied with the British, as were some Oneidas, and the Iroquois in St. Leger's camp met in council and decided to send the Patriot-allied Oneidas a bloody hatchet. Brant's Mohawks raided and burned the Oneida settlement of Oriska later in the siege. In retaliation, the Oneidas plundered the Mohawk strongholds of Tonarogi and Canajoharie. They later raided the Fort Hunter Mohawks, promoting most of the remaining Mohawks in central New York to flee to Quebec. When the British force returned from Oriskany, they arrived at a camp that had been stripped of much, including personal belongings, and the blankets of Indians slept in. Combined with the fact that the battle at Oriskany had cost so many Indian lives, this greatly upset the Indians. They had been told that the white man, who had thus far fought relatively little, would do most of the fighting. This breach of trust damaged relations between the Indians and St. Leger and became instrumental in the eventual failure of the siege. St. Leger took advantage of his victory to deliver another demand for the fort's surrender, which Gravensroot also rejected. The next day, St. Leger sent in a third surrender demand, which included false news that Burgoyne was in Albany as well as threats that the Indians would be permitted to massacre the garrison and destroy the Mohawk Valley communities, from which the garrison was drawn. In an eloquent refusal, Lieutenant Colonel Willett responded, "By your uniform you are British officers, therefore let me tell you that the message you have brought is a degrading one for a British officer to send, and by no means reputable for a British officer to carry." Taking advantage of a brief truce, Ravensroot sent Willett and another officer out on August 8th to notify Schuyler of their situation. After making their way through swampy territory on the British lines, they continued down the Mohawk Valley, eventually meeting a relief column under the command of Major General Benedict Arnold. Yes, still that Benedict Arnold. Schuyler had received early reports of the action at Oriskany on August 8th, and dispatched Ebenezer Leonard's 4th Massachusetts Regiment to relieve the besieged fort the next day. On August 12th, even before Willett could reach him, Schuyler held a war council to decide how to deal with the combined threats of St. Leger and Burgoyne, whose large army had reached the Hudson River. Amid concerns that the withdrawal from Ticonderoga by General Arthur St. Clair would be repeated at Stanwix, the council decided, with near unanimity, not to send a relief column to Fort Stanwix. In opposition to the council, Schuyler insisted on a relief expedition, which General Arnold offered to lead. In addition to Schuyler's actions, Major General Israel Putnam, based in Peekskill, New York, on August 14th, dispatched 2 regiments, the 1st Canadian and the 2nd New York, which were already on guard duty in the Mohawk River Valley. These 2 units were still en route when the siege was lifted and turned back. On August 20th, Arnold, Willett, and 700 Connecticut Army regulars had arrived at Fort Dayton. In an interest to enlarge his forces, Arnold tried to interest the Tyrone County men in another attempt against St. Leger, but raised only about 100 men. He then decided to wait, hoping that friendly Oneida and other Indians would be convinced to join the effort, or that a request to Schuyler for another 1,000 men would be fulfilled. However, news reached him that the siege had reached a critical state, and that actions were necessary. St. Leger had learned that his guns were largely ineffective against the fort's walls from long range, so he began entrenching operations to establish positions closer to the fort. Ganesh Root reported that the siege trenches had reached within striking distance of one of the fort's bastions. Uncomfortable with the number of troops available to him, Arnold opted for a deception to sow trouble in the British camp. While at Fort Dayton, a number of Loyalists had been arrested, including Han Yost. Schuyler and Arnold convinced Han Yost, a member of the King's Royal Regiment of New York, who grew up with many of the Mohawk Indians attacking Fort Stanwix, to spread rumors that large numbers of Americans, under the command of the Dark Eagle, were about to descend on St. Leger's camp. Han Yost's good conduct was assured by holding hostages of his brother. Arnold's stratagem seems to have met with some success. St. Leger recorded on August 21st that Arnold was advancing by rapid and forced march with 3,000 men, even though Arnold was still at Fort Dayton on that day. When St. Leger held a council, about 200 Indians had already abandoned the camp, and in the council the remaining Indians, unhappy with siege warfare and the loss of their equipment, threatened to leave if he did not lift the siege. On August 22nd, St. Leger broke camp and began the trek back to Lake Ontario, leaving behind a sizable amount of equipment. A number of men from St. Leger's party deserted or were captured by the fort's garrison, including Han Yost. Arnold, whose force was augmented by the arrival of friendly Indians, advanced about 10 miles toward Fort Stanwix on August 23rd, when a messenger from Ravensroot notified him of St. Leger's departure. Pushing on, they reached the fort that evening. Early the next day, Arnold detached 500 men to pursue St. Leger, whose column was also being taunted and harassed by his formerly supportive Indian allies. An advance party reached the shores of Oneida Lake in heavy rain just as the last of St. Leger's boats were departing. Leaving the garrison at the fort with smaller outposts along the Mohawk, Arnold then hurried back with about 1,200 men to rejoin the main army. While still on Oneida Lake, St. Leger learned from an Indian messenger of the true state of Arnold's force. On August 27th, St. Leger wrote to Burgoyne from Oswego that he intended to join him by traveling via Lake Champlain. He reached Fort Ticonderoga on September 29th, but too late to assist Burgoyne. The advance of Burgoyne's army to Fort Edward was, as with its approach to Ticonderoga, preceded by a wave of Indians, which chased away the small contingent of troops left by Schuyler. These allies became impatient and began indiscriminate raids on frontier families and settlements, which had the effect of increasing rather than reducing local support for the American rebels. In particular, the death at Indian hands of the attractive young Loyalist settler Jane McCrea was widely publicized and served as a catalyst for rebel support, as Burgoyne's decision to not punish the perpetrators is seen as unwillingness or inability to keep the Indians under control. Even though the bulk of his army made the trip from Skenesborough to Fort Edward, in just 5 days, the army's lack of adequate transport served to delay the army again, as the supply train, hampered by a lack of draft animals and carts and wagons that were capable of dealing with the rough tracks through the wilderness, took time to follow. On August 3rd, messengers from General Howe finally succeeded in making their way through the American lines to Burgoyne's camp at Fort Edward. Numerous attempts by the British generals to communicate were frustrated by the capture and hanging of their messengers by the Americans. The messengers did not bring good news. On July 17th, Howe wrote that he was preparing to depart by sea with his army to capture Philadelphia, and that General Clinton, responsible for New York's defense, would act as occurrences may direct. Burgoyne refused to divulge the contents of this dispatch to his staff. Realizing that he now had a serious supply problem, Burgoyne decided to act on a suggestion that Baron Resdale had made to him in July. Resdale, whose forces Burgoyne had stationed at Castleton for a time while he was at Skenesborough, had observed that there was an area rich in draft animals and horses, which might be seized for the army's benefit, including the mounting of Rysdale's currently unmounted dragoons. Pursuing this idea, Burgoyne sent Colonel Frederick Baum's regiment to obtain supplies from the armory at Bennington, Vermont, on August 9th, along with some Brunswick dragoons. Baum's Germans left Burgoyne's camp at Fort Edward on August 9th and marched to Fort Miller, where they waited until they were joined by the Indians and a company of British marksmen. The company marched off towards Bennington on August 11th. In minor skirmishes along the way, they learned from prisoners taken that a sizable force was in place at Bennington. On August 14th, Baum's men encountered a detachment of Stark's men that had been sent out to investigate reports of Indians in the area. Stark's men retreated, destroying a bridge to delay Baum's advance. Stark, on receiving word of the approaching force, sent a request to Manchester for support, and then moved his troops out of Bennington towards Baum's force, setting up a defensive line. Baum sent a message to Burgoyne following the first contact, indicating that American force was larger than expected, that it was likely to retreat before him. He then advanced a few miles further until he neared Stark's position. He then realized that at least part of his first message was incorrect, so he sent a second message to Burgoyne requesting reinforcements. It rained for the next day and a half, preventing battle. During this time, Baum's men constructed a small redoubt at the crest of the hill and hoped that the weather would prevent the Americans from attacking before reinforcements arrived. Stark sent out skirmishers to probe the German lines and managed to kill 30 Indians in spite of the difficulties of keeping their gunpowder dry. Reinforcements for both sides marched out on the 15th. Travel was quite difficult due to the heavy rains. Burgoyne sent 550 men under Heinrich von Bremen, while Warner's company of about 350 Green Mountain Boys came south from Manchester under Lieutenant Samuel Stafford's command. Late on the night of August 15th, Stark was awakened by the arrival of Parson Thomas Allen and a band of Massachusetts militiamen from nearby Berkshire County who insisted on joining his force. In response to the minister's fiery threat that his men would never come out again if they were not allowed to participate, Stark is reported to have said, "Would you go now unto this dark and rainy night, go back to your people and tell them to set some rest if they can, and if the Lord gives us sunshine tomorrow, I do not give you fighting enough. I will never call on you to come again." Stark's forces again swelled the next day, with the arrival of some Stockbridge Indians, bringing his force, including Warner's men, to nearly 2,000 men. Stark was not the only beneficiary of unexpected reinforcements. Baum's force grew by almost 100 when a group of local loyalists arrived in his camp on the morning of August 16th. On the afternoon of August 16th, the weather cleared and Stark ordered his men to be ready to attack. Stark is reputed to have rallied his troops by saying they were to fight for their natural-born rights as Englishmen, and that he added that there were enemies, the Redcoats and the Tories. They are ours, or this night Molly Stark sleeps a widow. Upon hearing this, the militia had melted away into the woods. Baum assumed the Americans were retreating or redeploying. However, Stark had decided to capitalize on the weakness in the Germans' wildly distributed position, and had sent sizable flanking parties to either side of his lines. These movements were assisted by a ruse employed by Stark's men that enabled them to get closer safely without alarming the opposing forces. The Germans, most of whom spoke no English, had been told that the soldiers with bits of white paper in their hats were loyalists and should not be fired on. Stark's men had also heard, and many of them suitably adorned their hats. When the fighting broke out at around 3 p.m., the gunfire, which Stark described as the hottest engagement he had ever witnessed, the Loyalists and the Indian positions were overrun, causing many of them to flee or surrender. This left Baum and his Brunswick dragoons trapped alone on the high ground. The Germans fought valiantly even after running low on powder and the destruction of their ammunition wagon. In desperation, the dragoons led a saber charge in an attempt to break through the enveloping forces. The charge failed horrendously, resulting in massive German casualties and gaining no ground on the rebels. Baum was mortally wounded in this final charge, and the remaining Germans surrendered. After the battle ended, while Stark's militiamen were busy disarming the prisoners and looting their supplies, Bremen arrived with his reinforcements. Seeing the Americans in disarray, they immediately pressed their attack. After hastily regrouping, Stark's forces tried to hold their ground against the new German onslaught, but began to fall back. Before their lines collapsed, Warner's men arrived on the scene to reinforce Stark's troops. Pitched battle continued until dark, when both sides disengaged. Bremen began a hasty retreat. He had lost 1/4 of his forces and all of his artillery pieces. Total German and British losses at the Bennington were recorded at 207 dead and 700 captured. American losses included 30 American dead and 40 wounded. The battle was at times particularly brutal when Loyalists met Patriots, and in some cases they came from the same communities. The prisoners, who were kept first in Bennington, were eventually marched to Boston. Burgoyne's army was readying to cross the Hudson at Fort Edward on August 17th when he first word of the battle arrived. Believing that reinforcements might be necessary, Burgoyne marched the army towards Bennington until further word arrived that Berryman and the remnants of his force were returning. Stragglers continued to arrive throughout the day and night, while word of the disaster spread within the camp. The effect on Burgoyne's campaign was significant. Not only had he lost nearly 1,000 men, of which half were regulars, but he had also lost a crucial Indian support. In a council following the battle, many of the Indians who had traveled with him from Quebec decided to go home. This loss severely hampered Burgoyne's reconnaissance efforts in the days to come. The failure to bring in nearby supplies meant that he had to rely on supply lines that were eventually dangerously long, and that he eventually broke in September. When Burgoyne had been unaware of what St. Clair's calls for Militiaport, following the withdrawal from Ticonderoga, had been answered, and General John Stark had placed 2,000 men at Bennington, Stark's force enveloped bombs at Bennington, killing him and capturing most of his detachment. The death of John McCree and the Battle of Bennington, besides acting as rallying cries for the Americans, had another important effect. Burgoyne blamed his Indians and Canadian allies for McCree's death, and even after the Indians had lost 80 of their number at Bennington, Burgoyne showed them no gratitude. As a result, Langlade, LaCoin, and most of the Indians left the British camp, leaving Burgoyne with fewer than 100 Indian scouts. Burgoyne was left with no protection in the woods against the American Rangers. Burgoyne would later blame LaCoin for deserting him, while LaCournay countered that Burgoyne never respected the Indians. In the British Parliament, Lord Germain sided with LaCournay. While the tactic of delaying worked well in the field, the result in the Continental Congress was a different matter. General Horatio Gates was in Philadelphia when Congress discussed its shock at the fall of Ticonderoga, and Gates was more than willing to help assign the blame to reluctant generals. Some in the Congress had already been impatient with General George Washington, wanting a large, direct confrontation that might eliminate occupation forces, but Washington feared would probably lose the war. John Adams, the head of the War Committee, praised Gates and remarked that we shall never hold a post until we shoot a general. Over the objections of the New York delegation, Congress sent Gates to take command of the Northern Department on August 10th. It also ordered states from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts to call out their militias. On August 19th, Gates arrived at Albany to take charge. He was cold and arrogant in manner and potentially excluded Schuyler from the First War Council. Schuyler left for Philadelphia shortly after, depriving Gates of his intimate knowledge of the area. Throughout the month of August and continuing into September, militia companies arrived at the Continental Army camps on the Hudson. These were augmented by troops Washington ordered north from the Hudson Highlands as part of General Arled's operation to relieve Stanwix. Those troops arrived at the end of August and included the crack sharpshooters of Daniel Morgan's Rifle Corps, which he sent north from his own army. News of the American success at Bennington and Fort Stanwix, combined with the outrage over the death of Jane McCreary, rallied support, swelling Gates' army to over 6,000 rank and file. This number did not include Stark's small army at Bennington, which was reduced in size by disease and the departure of some of its companies, but was also augmented by several hundred troops raised by General Benjamin Lincoln, who was assigned to make attacks against Burgoyne's supply and communications. The Battle of Saratoga is often depicted as a single event, but it was actually a month-long series of maneuvers punctuated by two battles. First, Saratoga, the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Moving cautiously since the departure of his Native American support had deprived him of reliable reports of the American position, Burgoyne advanced to the south after crossing the Hudson. On September 18th, the vanguard of his army had reached a position just north of Saratoga, about 4 miles from the American defensive line, and skirmishes occurred between American scouting parties and the leading elements of his army. The American camp had become a bed of festering intrigue ever since Arnold's return from Fort Stanwix. While he and Gates had previously been on reasonably good terms, in spite of their prickly egos, Arnold managed to turn Gates against him by taking on officers friendly to Schuyler as staff, dragging him into the ongoing feud between the two men. These conditions had not yet reached a boiling point on September 19th, but the day's events contributed to the situation. Gates had assigned the left wing of the defense to Arnold, and assumed command himself of the right, which was normally assigned to General Lincoln, whom Gates had detached in August with some troops to harass the British positions behind Burgoyne's army. Both Burgoyne and Arnold understood the importance of the American left, and the need to control the heights there. After the morning fog lifted around 10 a.m., Burgoyne ordered the army to advance in 3 columns. Baron Rejdessel led the left column, consisting of the German troops and the 47th Foot, on the river road, bringing the main artillery and guarding supplies and the boats on the river. General James Inglis Hamilton commanded the center column, consisting of the 9th, 20th, 21st, and 62nd regiments, which would attack the heights, and General Simon Fraser led the right wing with the 24th Regiment and the light infantry and grenadier companies, to turn the American left flank by negotiating the heavily wooded high ground north and west of Venice Heights. Arnold also realized such a flanking maneuver was likely, and petitioned Gates for permission to move his forces from the heights to meet potential movements, where the American skill at woodland combat would be an advantage. Gates, who preferred strategy was to sit and wait for the expected frontal assault, grudgingly permitted a reconnaissance in force consisting of Daniel Morgan's men and Henry Dearborn's light infantry. When Morgan's men reached an open field northwest of Venice Heights, belonging to Loyalist John Freeman, they spotted British advanced troops in the field. Fraser's column was slightly delayed and had not yet reached the field, while Hamilton's column had also made its way across the ravine and was approaching the field from the east through dense forest and difficult terrain. Rejdessel's force, while it was on the road, was delayed by obstacles thrown down by the Americans once again. The sound of gunfire to the west prompted Rejdessel to send some of his artillery down a track in that direction. The troops Morgan's men saw one advanced company of Hamilton's column. Morgan placed marksmen at strategic positions. When they picked off virtually every officer in the advance company, Morgan and his men then charged, unaware that they were headed directly for Burgoyne's main army. While they succeeded in driving back the advance company, Fraser's leading edge arrived just in time to attack Morgan's left, scattering his men back into the woods. James Wilkinson, who had ridden forward to observe the fire, returned to the American camp for reinforcements. As the British company fell back towards the main column, the leading edge that column opened fire, killing a number of their own men. There was then a lull in the fighting around 1 p.m. as Hamilton's men began to form up on the north side of the field and American reinforcements began to arrive from the south. Learning that Morgan was in trouble, Gates ordered out 2 more regiments, the 1st and the 3rd New Hampshire, to support him, with additional regiments, the 2nd New York, the 4th New York, and the 1st Canadian and Connecticut Militia, from the brigades of Enoch-Port to follow. Burgoyne arrayed Hamilton's men with the 21st on the right, the 20th on the left, and the 62nd in the center, with the 9th held in reserve. The battle then went through phases, alternating between intense fighting and breaks in the action. Morgan's men had regrouped in the woods and picked off officers and artillerymen. They were so effective at reducing the latter that the Americans several times gained brief control of the British field pieces, only to lose them in the next British charge. At one point, it was believed that Burgoyne himself had been taken down by a sharpshooter. It was instead one of Burgoyne's aides, riding a richly dressed horse, who was the victim. The center of the British line was very nearly broken at one point, and only the intervention of General Phillips leading the 20th made it possible for the 62nd to reform. The final stroke of the battle belonged to the British. Around 3 p.m., Riedel sent a messenger to Burgoyne for instructions. He returned 2 hours later with orders to guard the baggage train, but also to send as many men as he could to spare towards the American right flank. In a calculated risk, Riedel left 500 men to guard the vital supply train and marched off towards the action with the rest of his column. 2 of his companies advanced on the double and opened vicious fire on the American right, and Fraser's force threatened to turn the American left flank. In response to the latter threat, Arnold requested more forces, and Gates allowed him to dispatch Ebenezer Leonard's brigade, 2nd, 8th, and 9th Massachusetts. If Arnold had been on the field, these forces might have instead faced the larger danger posed by Riedel's forces. Fortunately for the American right, darkness set in, bringing an end to the battle. The Americans retreated back to their defenses, leaving the British on the field. Burgoyne had gained the field of battle, but suffered nearly 600 casualties. Most of these were the Hamilton center column, where the 62nd was reduced in size of a single company, and 3/4 of the artillerymen were killed or wounded. American losses were nearly 300 killed and seriously wounded. It has been widely recounted in the histories of the battle that General Arnold was on the field, directing some of the action. However, John Lesiter, a former park historian of the Saratoga National Historical Park, carefully documents the evolution of this story and believes it's without foundation in contemporary materials that Arnold remained at Gates' headquarters, receiving news and dispatching orders through messengers. Arnold biographer James Kirby Martin, however, disagrees with Lauderdale, arguing that Arnold played a more active role at Freeman's Farm by directing Patriot troops into position and possibly leading some charges before being ordered back to headquarters by Gates. Burgoyne's council discussed whether to attack the next day, and a decision was reached to delay further action at least 1 day to September 21st. The army moved to consolidate the position closer to the American line, while some men collected their dead. The attack on the 21st was called off when Burgoyne received a letter dated September 12th from Henry Clinton, who was commanding the British garrison in New York City. Clinton suggested that he could make a push at Fort Montgomery in about 10 days. Fort Montgomery was an American post on the Hudson River in the New York Highlands south of West Point. If Clinton left New York on September 22nd, about 10 days after he wrote the letter, he still could not hope to arrive in the vicinity of Saratoga before the end of the month. Burgoyne, running low on men and food, and was still in a very difficult position, but he decided to wait in the hope that Clinton would arrive to save his army. Burgoyne wrote to Clinton on September 23rd requesting some sort of assistance or diversion to draw Gates' army away. Clinton sailed from New York on October 3rd and captured Forts Montgomery and Clinton on October 6th. The furthest north any of his troops reached was Claremont, where they raided the estates of the prominent patriot Livingston family on October 16th. Unknown to either side of Saratoga, General Lincoln and Colonel John Brown had staged an attack against the British position at Fort Ticonderoga. Lincoln had collected 2,000 men at Bennington by early September. Brown and a detachment of 500 men captured poorly defended positions between Ticonderoga and Lake George, and then spent several days ineffectually bombarding the fort. These men, some of the prisoners they freed along the way, were back in the American camp by September 29th. In the American camp, the mutual resentment between Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold finally exploded into open hostilities. Gates quickly reported the actions of September 19th to the Congress and Governor George Clinton of New York, but he failed to mention Arnold at all, taking full credit for the victory, or in the battle. The field commanders and men universally credit Arnold for their success. Almost all the troops involved were from Arnold's command, and Arnold was the one directing the battle while Gates sat in his tent. Arnold protested, and dispute escalated into a shouting match that ended with Gates relieving Arnold of his command and giving it to Benjamin Lincoln. Arnold asked for a transfer to Washington's command, which Gates granted, but instead of leaving, he remained in his tent. There is no documentary evidence for a commonly recounted anecdote that a petition signed by line officers convinced Arnold to stay in camp. During this period, there were almost daily clashes between pickets and patrols of the two armies. Morgan's sharpshooters, familiar with the strategy and tactics of woodland warfare, constantly harassed British patrols on the western flank. As September passed into October, it became clear that Clinton was not coming to help Burgoyne, who put the army on short rations on October 3rd. The next day, Burgoyne called a war council in which several options were discussed, but no conclusive decisions were made. When the council resumed the next day, Verdesser proposed retreat, in which he was supported by Fraser. Burgoyne refused to consider it, insisting that retreat would be disgraceful. They finally agreed to conduct an assault on the American left flank with 2,000 men, more than one-third of the army, on October 7th. The army he was attacking, however, had grown in the interval. In addition to the return of Lincoln's detachment, militiamen and supplies continued to pour into the American camp, including critical increases in ammunition, which had been severely defeated in the first battle. The army Burgoyne faced on October 7th was more than 12,000 men strong and was led by a man who knew how much trouble Burgoyne was in. Gates had received consistent intelligence from the stream of deserters leaving the British lines and had also intercepted Clinton's response to Burgoyne's plea for help. Second Saratoga, the Battle of Bemis Heights, October 7th. While Burgoyne's troops' strength was nominally high, he likely had only about 5,000 effective battle-ready troops on October 7th, as losses from the earlier battles in the campaign and desertions following the September 19th battle had reduced his forces. General Reidesel advised that the army retreat. Burgoyne decided to reconnoiter the American left flank to see if an attack was possible. As an escort, the generals took Fraser's advanced corps, with light troops in the 24th Foot on the right and the combined British Grenadiers on the left, and a force drawn from all the German regiments in the army in the center. There were 8 British cannon under Major Williams and 2 Hesse-Hanau cannon under Captain Pauschitz. Leaving the camp between 10 and 11 a.m., they advanced about 3/4 of a mile to Bachelor's wheat field on a rise above Millbrook, where they stopped to observe the Americans' position. While the field afforded some room for artillery to work, the flanks were dangerously close to the surrounding woods. Gates followed the removal of Arnold from the field command, assumed command of the American left, and gave the right to General Lincoln. When American scouts brought news of Burgoyne's movement to Gates, he ordered Morgan's riflemen out of the far left with Poor's men, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd New Hampshire, on the left, and the 2nd and 4th New York regiments on the right, and Leonard's 1st New York, 1st Canadian, 2nd and 8th and 9th Massachusetts regiments, plus militia companies in the center. A force of 1,200 New York militia under Brigadier General Abraham Ten Broekirk was held in reserve behind Leonard's line. In all, more than 8,000 men took the field that day, including 1,400 men from Lincoln's command that were deployed when their actions became particularly fierce. The opening fire became between 2 and 2:30 p.m. from the British Grenadiers. Poor's men held their fire, and the terrain made the British shooting largely ineffective. When Major Auckland led the British Grenadiers in a bayonet charge, the Americans finally began shooting at close range. Auckland fell, shot in both legs, and many of the Grenadiers also went down. The column was a total rout, and Poor's men advanced to take Auckland and Williams prisoner and capture their artillery. On the American left, things were also not going well for the British. Morgan's men swept aside the Canadians and Native Americans to engage Fraser's regulars. Although slightly outnumbered, Morgan managed to break up several British attempts to move west. While General Fraser was mortally wounded in the phase of the battle, a frequently told story claiming that it be work of Timothy Murphy, one of Morgan's men, appears to be a 19th century fabrication. The fall of Fraser and the arrival of Ten Broek's large militia brigade, which roughly equaled the entire British reconnaissance force in size, broke the British will, and they began a disorganized retreat towards their entrenchments. Burgoyne was also very nearly killed by one of Morgan's marksmen. 3 shots hit his horse, hat, and waistcoat. The first phase of the battle lasted about an hour, and cost Burgoyne nearly 400 men, including the capture of most of the grenadiers' command and 6 of the 10 field pieces brought into the action. At this point, the Americans were joined by an unexpected participant, General Arnold, who was betraying great indignation and wrath in the American camp and may have been drinking, rode out to join the action. Gates immediately sent Major Armstrong after him with orders to return. Armstrong did not catch up with Arnold until the action was effectively over. A letter written by a witness to proceedings in the camp suggests that Arnold did in fact have authorization from Gates to engage in this action. The defenses on the right side of the British camp were anchored by 2 redoubts. The outermost one was defended by about 300 men under the command of the Hessian Heinrich von Bremen, while the other was under the command of Lord Baclaris. A small contingent of Canadians occupied the ground between these 2 fortifications. Most of the retreating force headed for Baclar's position, as Berryman's was slightly north and further away from the early action. Arnold led the American chase, and then led Poor's men in an attack on the Baclar's redoubt. Baclar's had set up his defenses well, and the redoubt was held, in an action so fierce that Burgoyne afterwards wrote, "More determined perseverance than they showed, it is not in any officer's experience." Seeing that the advance was checked, and that Learned was preparing to attack the Bremen redoubt, Arnold moved towards that action, recklessly riding between the lines and remarkably emerging unhurt. He led the charge at Leonard's men through the gap between the redoubts, which exposed the rear of Bremen's position, where Morgan's men had circled around from the far side. In a furious battle, the redoubt was taken and Bremen was killed. Arnold's horse was hit in one of the final volleys, and Arnold's leg was broken by both shot and the falling horse. This is one of the injuries that would cause him to no longer be a combat general. Major Armstrong finally caught up with Arnold and officially ordered him back to headquarters. He was carried back in a litter. Arnold wished that he was shot in the heart, knowing that if he had died in the battle, he would have kept the fame as a heroic martyr. The capture of Bremen's redoubt exposed the British camp, but darkness was setting in. An attempt by some Germans to retake the redoubt ended in capture as darkness fell and an unreliable guide led them into the American lines. Burgoyne then ordered the army, whose entrenchments had been subjected to persistent harassment by the Americans, to retreat. One consequence of the skirmish was that General Lincoln was also wounded. Combined with Arnold's wound, this deprived Gates of his top 2 field commanders. It took the army nearly 2 days to reach Saratoga, in which heavy rain and American probes against the column slowed the army's pace. Burgoyne was aided by logistical problems in the American camp, where the army's ability to move forward was hampered by delays in bringing forward and issuing rations. However, Gates did order detachments to take positions on the east side of the Hudson to oppose any attempted crossings. By the morning of October 13th, Burgoyne's army had completely surrounded, so the council voted to open negotiations. Terms were agreed on October 16th, that Burgoyne insisted on calling a convention rather than a capitulation. Baroness Redesel, wife of the commander of the German troops, vividly describes in her journal the confusion and besetting starvation of the retreating British army. Her account of the tribulations and death of officers and men, and of the terrified women who had taken shelter in the cellar of what would later become known as the Marshall House, dramatizes the desperation of the besieged army. On October 17th, Burgoyne's army surrendered, with full honors of war. Burgoyne gave his sword to Gates, who immediately returned it as a sign of respect. Burgoyne's army, about 6,000 strong, marched past to stack arms as the American and British bands played Yankee Doodle and the British Grenadiers. British troops withdrew from Ticonderoga and Crown Point in November, and Lake Champlain was free of British troops by early December. American troops, on the other hand, still had work to do. Alerted to General Clinton's raid on the Hudson, most of the army marched south toward Albany on October 18th, while the other detachments accompanied the Convention Army east. Burgoyne and Redesel became guests of General Schuyler, who had come north from Albany to witness the surrender. Burgoyne was allowed to return to England on parole in May 1778, where he spent the next 2 years defending his actions in Parliament and the press. He was eventually exchanged for more than 1,000 American prisoners. In response to Burgoyne's surrender, Congress declared December 18, 1777 as a national day for solemn thanksgiving and praise. And a recognition of the military success at Saratoga, it was the nation's first official observation of a holiday with the name. Under the terms of the convention, Burgoyne's army was to march to Boston, where British ships were transported back to England on the condition that its members were not to participate in the conflict until they were formally exchanged. Congress demanded that Burgoyne provide a list of troops in the army so that the terms of the agreement concerning future combat was enforced. When he refused, Congress decided not to honor the terms of the convention, and the army remained in captivity. The army was kept for some time in sparse camps throughout New England, although individual officers were exchanged. Much of the conventional army was eventually marched south to Virginia, where it remained in prison for 7 years. Throughout the captivity, a large number of men, more than 1,300 in the first year alone, escaped and effectually deserted, settling in the United States. And that's the end of the campaign in Saratoga, which is a major victory for the United States and the colonials. And there are a few points about General Arnold's participation in the battle. One of his slights that he sees as slights that he uses later on in his when he discusses with Congress about what he is owed is that Gates did not give him enough credit for the battles. And that could be seen. That actually could be. You could argue that he was not given enough credit for the battle itself. But as we know, General Arnold becomes a traitor and he leaves the American army for the British, which we will talk about later. But at the battlefield of Saratoga, there are two instances regarding this. Him becoming a traitor. One is a monument to his boot that was placed by would become a Civil War general. There's a monument, it's the shape of a boot, and it talks about how this was the last part of General Arnold that was a patriot, and it died here. And really, if you look at General Arnold's story, this is where stopping becoming a field general is what causes him to become very melancholy and opens himself up to being approached by Major John Andre of the British to become a prisoner, to become a traitor. Also, there is a victory monument at the Battle of Saratoga. It is beautiful. It has 4 statues. It's supposed to have 4 statues. It actually only has 3 because there was one for each direction. The north one is Horatio Gates. The east one was for Philip Schuyler, and the west is for Daniel Morgan. Well, the one facing south was supposed to be General Arnold, but because he became a traitor, it has always been left blank, and there is no statue there. This victory by the Americans would be very important in international scopes, though at the same time, which we'll discuss next episode, Philadelphia is being captured. This victory at Saratoga is showing those like the French and the Spanish and those in an international eye that the Americans can stand up to the British. They can win in major campaigns. Trenton and Princeton showed small campaigns. These are major campaigns that the Americans can win. And you will find that the French directly relate to the Battle of Saratoga and the Saratoga victories as their reasoning behind coming into the war on the side of the Americans and actually giving them armed support instead of just allowing them to use their ports. So not only will the British be facing the Americans, they will be facing the French army, the French navy in battles to come after the conclusion of the Philadelphia campaign that we'll talk about next episode. After next episode, fighting in the north will be done. It'll go to the southern colonies, and that's a whole new set of, you'll have the French involved, you'll have the Americans fighting with the French Navy coming into play, which can rival the British Navy. But this sets up the stage. This is really the turning point in the war here. This major offensive comes down from Quebec, and it gets obliterated. Of course, there could be reasons why Howe doesn't support it. Burgoyne angers his Indian allies, supply problems, mistakes. But it shows American resolve, a colonial resolve to stand and fight, where there had been retreats in 1776. In 1777, the Americans stand and fight, and they win in large numbers here at the Battle of Saratoga, the two main battles in Saratoga. This changes the course of the war here. If the battles of Trenton and Princeton allow you to continue the war, this shows the world that the Americans might be able to win. They can win their independence. But that's going to be all for this week's episode. Next week, we're going to cover, which will happen at the same time of the events that we talked about just now, the Philadelphia campaign. And if we have time, we'll go into Valley Forge. I think we'll go into Valley Forge, or if that, we might give Valley Forge its own episode. But as always, I would like to thank everybody for joining us. If you would like to support the channel, there are a few ways you can do it. You can, of course, share it with your friends, share it on Facebook, your social medias, anywhere you would like to share it. Media links will be in the show notes, as always. If you would like to financially support the show, there will be a link in the show notes as well. Any financial support will go to improving quality of the show with recording software and equipment. And if you believe there's a topic you would like us to cover, if there's a historical topic you would like to cover, we are getting to the end of the American Revolution. If there's something that you would like us to cover in the next set of topics, please get on Facebook, send us a message, send me a message. I will research it, I'll get into it, and we will get some topics. I think next is going to be the War of 1812, because it kind of relates with that, but we may have some interludes so that we have some breaks between military history and get into some more political history. We have the Convention of States, we have the Bill of Rights. We get away from American history and go into some world history as well. But until our next episode, I'm Jonathan. This is the History Desk, and thank you always for joining us. And as always, never stop learning, never stop reading. Share your history, keep it alive. But until next time, I'll see you later. Goodbye.